Hey guys, tonight we are stepping barefoot onto the warm, sun-baked stones of an Assyrian courtyard, where every flower is a flex, every tree a trophy, and every chirping bird suspiciously engineered to sing praises of the king. Imagine towering, palms imported across deserts just to shade one royal nap spot. Picture water features so complicated they'd make your local city planner break into a sweat. This is horticulture as hard power, and you're about to walk through it, very slowly, very sleepily. Now, full disclosure, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not because of any dramatic beheadings or sand vipers, though both were available options, but because the sheer effort it took to maintain royal dignity in ancient Assyria was exhausting. If you didn't bow at the right angle while complimenting the king's sycamore arrangement, you might find yourself reassigned to canal cleaning duty in 110-degree heat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far and wide this little time machine travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the garden courtyard of Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud. The air smells faintly of date syrup, stone dust, and something more ancient, like yesterday's rain on cracked limestone. Palm fronds rustle above you. A gardener, not a peasant, but a trained temple-grade landscape artisan, lowers his head. As he passes, his tunic damp from the canal spray. This is the personal pleasure garden of Ashur-nasir-pal II, and he didn't just plant it for shade. He planted it for glory. You're standing in a biography written in cedar and juniper. Assyrian kings knew that words fade, but trees grow. So instead of carving all their victories in stone, though they did plenty of that, they also carved them into soil. The gardens were a soft power display in a hard power empire. You don't just conquer a mountain range. You dig up its flora and force it to thrive in your courtyard. Like a pet. Like a hostage with roots. Historians still argue whether these gardens were ever open to the public or if they remained sealed, behind walls as elite dreamscapes. Some think visiting dignitaries were marched through them as part of a carefully orchestrated intimidation ritual. Look upon my pomegranates, ye mighty in despair. The layout is geometric, almost neurotically so. Symmetry was sacred. One crooked olive tree, and the whole thing might be seen as a bad omen, or worse, bad aesthetics. Every path is straight, every intersection mirrors another, like a chessboard. Designed by someone with absolute control issues, and the plants, oh the plants. Fig trees from Syria, tamarisks from the Zagros foothills, mulberries, willows, even vines trained to climb lattices imported from Egypt. It's less gardening and more botanical imperialism. A bronze plaque near one entryway, probably, not visible to ancient garden-goers but found by archaeologists, brags about the king's green achievements. It reads more like a humble brag diary entry. I transplanted trees from lands I had conquered. I made them grow here. I created a paradise in the dust. Notably, he doesn't thank the 300 laborers who hauled those root balls on their backs. But you weren't expecting a unionized gardening staff, were you? One mainstream fact that keeps resurfacing is how these royal gardens were often tethered to temples, particularly those honoring Ishtar or Ninurta. There was something divine about growing rare things where they shouldn't grow. It mirrored the king's ability to impose order on chaos, life on desert. Now, the quirky bit? There's credible evidence that one king, possibly Sennacherib, had his name carved onto specific trees, like a divine version of Property of Kevin scrawled into a middle school desk. It's unclear whether this was devotional, delusional, or just good old-fashioned monarchical branding. You pass a small pavilion with stone benches that are surprisingly cool despite the sun. Behind it, a water channel gurgles gently. Not a river, too disorderly, but a controlled flow engineered to curve exactly where the eye needs it to. There's no algae, no frogs. Everything here has been sterilized of accident. Still, something stirs. A jackal slinks between two rows of cypress, ignoring you entirely. Even here, the wilderness tries to slip in. There's a quiet here that isn't quite peaceful. It's performative, like the garden is trying to convince you of something. That nature loves the king, that water obeys him, that no matter where the sun hits, it will always land beautifully on his side of the bench. This isn't about relaxation, it's about control, and yet, as you keep walking, your breathing slows. The cadence of footsteps on gravel, the rhythm of leaf movement, even the faint slap of sandals from a distant corridor, it all syncs. The message might be dominance, but the delivery is hypnotic. You stop by a low wall where some ancient graffiti lingers, maybe a scribe's bored sketch or a gardener's inside joke. A stick figure with a crown holding what looks suspiciously like a watering can. Maybe power was always a little silly. You take a left turn where a palm frond casts a fan-shaped shadow across the path, and you step into a new part of the garden, shaded and silent, save for the hum of bees pretending to be professional staff. The courtyard opens wider here, lined with rows of sycamore fig trees, their waxy leaves glinting like polished armor. You don't just see the layout, you feel it, the strict order, the intentional balance, the message. This section of the palace, garden isn't about plants, it's about performance. Assyrian kings, particularly Ashur-nasir-pal II and Sargon II, didn't just sit around in these courtyards sipping date wine and watching the birds. Well, they did that too, but only as part of a larger scheme. These spaces were backdrops for political theater, stages for power posturing, and possibly the ancient world's earliest examples of curated branding. Imagine foreign envoys trudging through scorching Mesopotamian streets only to arrive at this oasis, where the air is cooler, the light diffused by trellised grapevines, and the king lounges beside a water feature that murmurs like a trained diplomat. Every stone is a statement. I control beauty, balance, and even the seasons. How hard could crushing your little rebellion be? Historians still argue whether these garden meetings had structured scripts or were free-form intimidation. One theory suggests that elaborate floral arrangements were shifted daily, so visiting guests never saw the same garden twice. That's right. Landscape as an ever-changing chessboard of status. And you thought your HOA was intense. Let's not forget the throne platform. At the very center of some of these courtyards stood an elevated seat for the king, raised not just physically, but symbolically, as if to say, yes, I belong above the papyrus. From that platform, he could receive tribute, pronounce justice, or more likely, nod sagely, while scribes furiously recorded his latest aphorism about olives. One particularly juicy record claims that Ashur-nasir-pal held audiences in a citrus grove designed to replicate the climate of the Levant. That's like having diplomatic talks in your very own simulated Provence. Highly niche, very extra, and then there's the use of stone inscriptions. These weren't just Dear Diary, notes hammered into slabs. They were press releases. Statements about the king's divinely endorsed horticultural brilliance, etched in Akkadian and scattered tastefully around the garden, like motivational quotes in a yoga studio, but way more aggressive. I caused cedars to grow where there were none, one proclaims. I created gardens in the desert with the wisdom the gods bestowed upon me. Sounds humble. Quirky fact of the day? Some palace courtyards even had miniature mountains, artificial mounds dotted with shrubs and capped with trees, meant to mimic the terrain of conquered lands. You're not sure whether to be impressed or worried someone was compensating for something. The political messages weren't subtle. Even the trees were arranged by rank and symbolism. Date palms signified prosperity, pomegranates, fertility and power, olive trees, longevity and civilization. Don't even ask what it meant if you sat in the wrong shade. It was basically a floral Game of Thrones with root systems. You pause under an archway draped with vines, each tendril trained with such precision it feels like the plant is bowing to you, or maybe judging you. These plants have seen things. The air here is cooler, thanks to something called Connaught-style water engineering. A clever network of underground channels keeps the garden damp and the visitors impressed. The sound of trickling. Water is no accident. It was calibrated to lull guests into a trance, lowering their guard just enough for the king to make his point without ever raising his voice. Still, not everything was showy. Some features are oddly human. There's a shallow stone basin with half-melted rose petals in it. Maybe the aftermath of a ritual wash. Maybe just leftovers from the queen's bath. Nobody seems to know, and maybe that's the point. Some details are there to remain mysterious, like a wink from a statue you're not entirely sure is winking. And speaking of statues, oh, the statues. Every 10 paces or so, you're watched by a lion, a winged bull, or a stern-looking bearded man, with sandals that scream executive. These aren't just garden ornaments, they're divine bouncers. And while you know they're stone, there's a whisper in the leaves that suggests maybe, just maybe, they blink when you're not looking. As you step around one such guardian, you notice a depression in the ground where the tiles are missing. A forgotten footprint of a long-dismantled pavilion. One theory says these were ephemeral structures, tents draped in fine linen, assembled for specific ceremonies and then quietly removed. Like mood lighting, but ancient and much heavier. The king didn't just dominate through war or taxes. He dominated through aesthetic, through moments, through the oppressive calm of a garden where the silence was louder than any speech. You feel that now, that hush, that balance between artificiality and serenity, where nothing is quite as natural as it seems, and everything is exactly where it needs to be. It's power through plants, and somehow it works. You drift further along the path, and the air shifts again, less formal, more fragrant, like you've wandered into a dream staged for maximum olfactory effect. The trees here aren't native. Their leaves shimmer in the sun just a bit too brightly, and their trunks have that tentative transplant survivor look, roots gripped tightly, but still asking the local soil for permission. These are trophy trees, imported status symbols. You're now in the section of the garden that screams, or rather gently sighs. I have conquered elsewhere. Ashurnasirpal II was especially fond of this tactic. He didn't just want victory, he wanted souvenirs. That bloomed. The farther a tree had traveled to be here, the more prestige it carried. It's the ancient equivalent of returning from war with a suitcase full of bespoke, endangered bonsai. Historians still argue whether these trees were gifts, from tribute-paying cities or forcefully relocated botanical prisoners. Either way, they came from as far as the Levant, the Zagros Mountains, and occasionally even the Egyptian Nile Delta. Tamarisks, date palms, pistachio trees, each root ball a little act of imperialism wrapped in burlap and prayer. You stop by, a sycamore with wide leaves that don't belong in Mesopotamian heat. A small ceramic tag still clings to its base, inscribed in cuneiform. The translation? Tree from the land of the Hittites. Imagine labeling your potted plant, acquired during invasion. But importing trees wasn't just for show. These alien botanicals had to be nurtured, sometimes with entirely new irrigation designs, soil amendments, and bizarre protective rituals. One account mentions priests chanting over young saplings during transplanting, not because the trees would die without it, but because the optics of failure were unacceptable. If the tree died, it might suggest divine disapproval. You can't conquer a kingdom and then let its pomegranate tree wilt. That's just sloppy. Branding. And oh, the branding. A palace inscription gleefully records how I, the king, caused mighty cedars from the mountain lands to kneel at the gates of my garden. Kneel. The man really believed his garden was kneecapping ecosystems. For his leisure. You start to wonder whether he actually liked plants, or just liked being the reason they grew. There's a rumor among archaeologists that one royal garden included a scent trail, a path lined with different trees and flowering shrubs, arranged not by sight, but by how their smells transitioned from one to the next. Think olfactory playlist, curated to rise and fall with every 10 steps. Jasmine to myrrh, myrrh to fig blossom, fig to cedar, an ambient mixtape for your nostrils. The mainstream fact most scholars agree on is that Assyrian kings tied these botanical feats directly to their legitimacy. Kingship wasn't just about military prowess. It was about demonstrating harmony with nature. If you could coax a foreign acacia to bloom in Nineveh, clearly the gods liked you better than your enemies. You wander into a grove of citrons, unnaturally short but absurdly fragrant. These were likely trimmed and pampered by a small army of gardeners who understood the politics of pruning. One wrong snip and suddenly you're demoted to fish scale removal duty in the royal kitchens. One quirk stands out. In some records, kings sent messengers back to conquered lands to collect pollen or clippings from trees of excellent character. Yes, there were ancient performance reviews for trees. It's unclear whether they used sap production, leaf density, or just general vibe. But the obsession was real. You stop and press your hand against a patch of sun-warmed bark. It's rough, but steady. Like it's been here far longer than anything around it, and maybe it has. Some trees outlived the kings who planted them, which historians love pointing out. It's a gentle kind of rebellion. The garden endures, even when the man behind it becomes a footnote. And yet, these trees weren't passive. They carried memory. Maybe not in the scientific sense, but in the emotional weight of the space. Foreign trees in Assyrian soil were both ornament and omen. Their survival said, "This world bends for me." Their death whispered, "This empire has limits." You catch sight of a twisted olive branch, half rotted and leaning too far. No, one replanted it. Maybe it was left on purpose, a symbolic shrug. A reminder that even curated beauty has blind spots. Birds dart overhead, not local ones, but species that migrated with the trees. You wonder if they know where they are, or if they just adapted, like everyone else. The sun shifts, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Imported fruit ripens quietly. You imagine a royal attendant plucking a fig, handing it reverently to a scribe who will place it on the king's plate with a flourish. Not because he's hungry, but because even snacking can be symbolic. You keep walking. The ground under your sandals changes texture. Looser gravel now, edged with neatly cut basalt tiles that trace their way beside a narrow, whispering stream. You're entering the hydraulic heart of the garden, where the real power wasn't in the trees or the flowers, but in the water that kept them alive. This is where irrigation became art, and art became infrastructure. You pause at a small stone basin where a trickle of water loops in from a copper spout shaped like a lion's mouth. It's not spitting, it's murmuring, like a courtier whispering gossip during a banquet, and that's the point. Water here isn't just functional, it's part of the aesthetic. An ambient feature engineered with obsessive flair. The Assyrians didn't invent irrigation, but they industrialized it with flair. They redirected rivers, dug kilometer-long canals, built aqueducts before the Romans ever had the idea, and designed water-lifting devices that might have made Archimedes raise an eyebrow. Ashurnasirpal II is thought to have used something akin to a shaduf, a lever system of counterweights, to hoist water into elevated cisterns that fed his garden's thirsty roots. Historians still argue whether the infamous Archimedean screw originated in Mesopotamia or came later with the Greeks. But there's archaeological evidence that some form of water spiral existed here. If so, it means this place wasn't just a kingdom. It was a think tank with landscaping. And if you're wondering how they kept the whole thing running without a central HVAC system, brace yourself for the overkill. Entire teams of workers maintained the flow. We're talking full-time canal cleaners, mud scrapers, pest chasers, and vine pruners, each with their own hierarchy. There's even mention of a chief of waters in one inscription. That's right, middle management, ancient edition. Now, imagine a dinner guest being led along this very path, shown how the water curved and fell in rhythmic cadences, synchronized with the garden layout. It's like walking through a symphony, composed of rocks, water, and roots. "Yes," the king would say without saying it, "I control rivers now. What have you done this year?" One mainstream fact, supported by multiple palace inscriptions, is the king's claim that he brought the Tigris to kneel. It sounds metaphorical until you remember they actually rerouted parts of the Tigris. It wasn't just flow. They manipulated the water table to ensure the palace complex could support lush vegetation in an area naturally prone to heat, dust, and dryness. Quirky detail. One recovered tablet describes waters made to climb walls, which some scholars interpret as a reference to vertical irrigation systems, proto-green walls, basically. Imagine moss-covered towers and trellises bursting with vines that got their hydration from clever tube systems hidden inside the stone. Either that, or the writer was having a poetic moment. Both are equally likely. As you walk beside the channel, you notice something subtle. The curve of the water feature isn't natural. It turns at intervals meant to line up with key sight lines in the palace windows. So when the king looked out, he saw shimmering light bending perfectly through his imported tree canopy. This wasn't nature, it was theater. The scent of damp earth mixes with rosemary. Somewhere in the distance you hear a rhythmic splash. Someone, maybe, pulling a bucket from a well. Or perhaps it's just the wind flirting with the reeds. Further ahead, a small stone plaque half buried in moss shows a carved map. A schematic of the irrigation system. Not drawn like ours, but not primitive either. Lines, symbols, channels. It's like finding blueprints in a sandbox. Whoever made this understood water not just as liquid, but as logic. The debate still simmers among scholars over how sustainable this system was. Did it overextend the water table? Was it environmentally risky long-term? Some argue these vast gardens contributed to salinization of the soil, a slow poison of salt buildup that eventually killed the fertility they worked so hard to create. But in this moment, it feels balanced. The stream whispers, the garden listens, and you, caught between the two, just breathe. You stop beside a marble bench inset with lapis lazuli. A royal resting place? Maybe. Or maybe it was a gardener's perch, polished by years of weary lunches under the fig trees. Either way, the view is perfect. Vines above, lilies below, and a shimmering channel of water twisting like a quiet snake through it all. The breeze picks up. Just enough to ripple the surface of the pool, just enough to brush the back of your neck with the cool dampness of engineered paradise. It smells like mint and wet clay. You think of the labor behind all this, the sheer volume of effort, brains, hands, backs, and bureaucratic scrolls it must have taken to keep these systems humming. A modern-day sprinkler system this is not. But it worked. It works. Even now in your mind, in this gentle walk through long-gone geometry, it flows. The path leads you through a narrow arbor. And just as your eyes adjust to the filtered light, something chirps. Not a bird, but a mechanism. A delicate whir, then a gentle, almost musical clink. You pause, not entirely sure whether the sound came from the trees or the palace walls. Welcome to the part of the garden where things start. Talking back. This isn't your average let the wind whistle through the bamboo setup. Assyrian engineers and artisans, possibly in cahoots with temple tinkerers, created garden installations designed to surprise, amuse, or, let's be honest, impress the absolute sandals off their guests. Among these curiosities, animated fountains with spouts shaped like lions, whose mouths periodically emitted water in controlled bursts. Some were gravity-fed, others may have used hidden weights or wind-powered bellows. There's one record of a fountain that roared on command, likely a clever combination of echo chambers and water pressure, or perhaps just a particularly expressive tour guide. Historians still argue whether these features were functional, art, or spiritual illusions. Were they simply mechanical toys, or was there an element of sacred theater here? After all, a fountain that sings in a space sacred to Ninurta, god of war and irrigation, sends a message that's hard to miss. And the talking statues? Not literal conversation, of course, but sound-producing devices. Copper birds with internal flutes that chirped when wind passed through them. One tablet from the reign of Sennacherib describes a tree that sings with the breeze, thought to be an artificial tree, possibly a frame draped in vines, embedded with tiny bell chimes and pipes tuned to mimic bird song. You sit on a low step near what remains of one of these oddities. The base is cracked, the piping gone, but the grooves where something once turned or clicked are still visible. You run your fingers along the indentations and feel a strange chill, the ghost of ingenuity. And then there's the acoustic stonework. Certain sections of the garden were built to enhance sound, paths where every step echoed in a particular rhythm, corridors where whispering was amplified, not muffled. One theory suggests these were designed for evening rituals, where voices would carry along predetermined sonic routes. Others say it was just an unintentional quirk of limestone and ambition. Either way, it's eerie and elegant. You walk on, and soon you're in the presence of a low stone wall with dozens of small carvings along its side. Not decorative patterns, but what look like schematic symbols. Some sort of rudimentary circuit, diagram, or perhaps a how-to manual for maintaining the garden's more eccentric features. There's even one glyph that looks suspiciously like a water wheel. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe this was Assyria's version of a tech lab. The mainstream historical fact here: the Assyrians employed full-time artisans whose sole job was to design and maintain complex mechanical and hydraulic installations. Not engineers in the modern sense, but specialized craftsmen trained in metal, water, and wind. Their names don't survive, but their fingerprints do, often literally, baked into the clay tablets they left behind. One fringe tidbit: there's a theory, whispered more than published, that Ashurbanipal's library included scrolls on mechanical philosophy, early musings on balance, flow, and design. No one's found them yet, but the idea that scribes were theorizing hydraulics alongside hymns isn't as wild as it sounds. You pause beside another oddity, a vine-covered trellis with tiny bells tied to the leaves. When the wind hits just right, it creates a lilting jingle, soft and strange, like a lullaby for birds. Were the bells there to attract winged visitors, or maybe to keep spirits away? Theories abound. What's certain is that someone cared enough to string sound into leaves, and that's the larger theme here: attention. The kings didn't just want beauty, they wanted reaction, response, proof that the world around them noticed, obeyed, applauded. Whether that came from chirping copper sparrows or clapping diplomats hardly mattered, as long as someone was impressed. You sit again, this time by a small platform that might have been a performer's stage. Some scholars think garden spaces, doubled as venues for storytelling, music, or ritual. A poet reciting lines about heroic battles while standing beneath a citrus tree imported from 900 miles away. That's peak aesthetic propaganda, and maybe that's what these mechanical marvels really were. Not gadgets, but metaphors. They made the invisible visible, wind into song, water into drama, motion into message. You lean back, close your eyes, and listen. Somewhere, not too far, a pipe stutters with the ghost of pressure long gone. A memory of splashing, a hiccup of air trapped in stone. The garden speaks, softly, always. You follow a curved path flanked by low walls of mud brick, their surfaces coated with faded glazes that once gleamed in the sun. Here the air shifts again, sweeter, thicker, almost cloying. Welcome to the perfumed walkways where scent wasn't just an afterthought, it was weaponized charm. The ancient Assyrians didn't merely plant flowers and hope for the best. They engineered smellscapes, carefully planned rows of aromatic herbs, resin-rich trees, and slow-burning incense holders turned this part of the garden into a kind of open-air perfume bottle. You're not just smelling jasmine, you're walking through it, coated by its invisible embrace. To your left, a line of flowering myrtle bushes buzzes with bees. To your right, stalks of sweet flags sway slightly, their fragrance earthy and clean. Underfoot, crushed rosemary and thyme release sleepy, little puffs of scent with every step. It's like aromatherapy curated by someone with absolute power and no budget constraints. Historians still argue whether certain pathways were intended to evoke specific emotional states. Tranquility before an audience, alertness before a judgment, or calm before a not-so-calm military briefing. Some tablets hint that the garden's layout mirrored the stages of a royal ritual. First the scents to soothe, then the scents to sharpen, then the ones to impress. And then there were the warning smells. Not every aroma was sweet. Kings occasionally had entire sections of the garden filled with sharp, acrid-smelling plants, onions, asafoetida, and even rotting fruit. Why? Some suggest they were a metaphorical barrier. Others think they signaled something more sinister. A subtle way of reminding visitors that danger, like certain odors, could be masked but never erased. You stop beneath a pergola where grapes once hung heavy. Clay incense burners line the pathway, tiny bowls now cracked with time. The ashes are long gone, but traces of resin still cling to the edges. Frankincense, myrrh, labdanum. These scents weren't just for pleasure. They were spiritual, medicinal, and political, a mainstream fact. These aromatic substances were expensive imports. Frankincense came from southern Arabia, myrrh from eastern Africa. Their presence here wasn't just olfactory, it was economic flex. If you could afford to burn incense just to make the garden smell nicer, you were doing something right. Or at least making sure everyone believed you were. Quirky detail? One record describes the king's pet lion, yes, he had one, being bathed in a blend of rosewater and cinnamon oil before garden appearances. Not because lions care about fragrance, but because everyone else did. You reach a curved wall that once shielded a private seating area. It's partially collapsed, revealing layers of plaster and pigment beneath. A floral motif still curls along the base. Blue lotus and red poppy, their meaning lost, but their intent unmistakable. This was a space meant to feel soft, enveloping, and safe. The joke, of course, is that nothing here was really soft. It was all choreographed. Some scholars think the scent combinations changed with the seasons, like ancient olfactory mood boards. In spring, more florals. In summer, cooling herbs. Autumn brought musky resins. Winter, probably indoor perfuming, with heated stones and infused oils creating vapor pockets around tightly sealed rooms. You crouch near a row of cracked amphorae. Their surfaces are stained, possibly from old rose oil. Maybe this was a refilling station. Or maybe it was the site of one particularly enthusiastic scent experiment that didn't go well. Either way, it smells faintly of time. As you walk on, the path narrows. You catch a waft of something surprisingly spicy, coriander maybe. A reminder that smell isn't just sweetness, it's memory. It's association. And in a garden like this, it's also strategy. This place didn't just want to impress you. It wanted to embed itself in your senses, to leave you dazed, off balance, uncertain whether you were entering a sacred space, a diplomatic trap, or both. The scent of something burnt clings to a stone ledge, not recent, not threatening, just ancient, like the memory of 100 torches once lining this walkway. You picture them flickering in the dark, their smoke curling skyward, sweet and strange, binding every passer-by in its invisible thread. One final fact: some incense blends used in these gardens were secret recipes, passed down through priestly families or guarded by the king's own perfumers. Their exact ingredients? Still debated. But it's believed some included crushed pearls, rare spices, and even traces of gold. You can almost hear the king muttering, "If it doesn't smell expensive, it's not doing its job." And so you walk, nose filled, eyes soft, ears tuned to silence. You're not just strolling, you're inhaling history. As the perfumed walkway fades behind you, the garden takes a sharper turn, not in layout, but in mood. The paths here feel narrower, the trees closer together, the air cooler. A cluster of tamarisk trees forms a dense canopy, and you step beneath it into a more secretive corner of the palace's green empire. This is the realm of strange plants, useful, dangerous, and sometimes suspiciously hard to categorize. You've entered the intelligence sector of the royal garden. Here, rare herbs grow in deliberately marked plots, each boxed in by low ridges of fired brick. Some look familiar: mint, garlic, fenugreek. Others are less welcoming: spiny desert rose, thick-stemmed euphorbia, a suspiciously glistening vine coiling like it has a secret. These weren't chosen for color or charm. They were chosen for what they could do. Assyrian kings, especially in the later Neo-Assyrian period, weren't above a bit of botanical espionage. They sent agents into foreign lands to collect samples of plants with interesting properties. Some for healing, some for poisoning, some because the plants allegedly bloomed only when eclipses approached. Science and superstition, always a package deal. Historians still argue whether these espionage missions were formal state policy or the result of curious scribes with too much ambition and too few ethics. Either way, the result was the same: a collection of plants that could help the king's body or end someone else's. Mainstream historical fact. The royal gardens of Nineveh had a section explicitly devoted to medicinal herbs. These weren't maintained by gardeners, but by court physicians, a duke they were called, who combined botany, astronomy, and a healthy dose of symbolic math to prescribe treatments and rituals. Think of them as ancient pharmacists with astrology, degrees, and anxiety-inducing confidence. The most fascinating quirk, though? A few of these plants were so rare that their names don't even exist in modern taxonomies. Clay tablets reference a blood-rooted vine that sings to the stars and a leaf of dark sleep. We're still not entirely sure what they were. Some suspect extinct species. Others think the poetic language veiled their true identity, in case the tablets fell into the wrong hands. Garden gatekeeping, 5th century BCE style. You pause beside a rectangular bed of meticulously spaced poppies, their petals fluttering in the breeze like they're trying to get your attention. Were they used for pain relief? Possibly. For dreams? Definitely. Poppies were sacred in many ancient Near Eastern traditions, associated with death, prophecy, and divine sleep. Further along, you spot a cluster of blue-green shrubs labeled in crumbling cuneiform, likely some species of mandrake. Yes, that mandrake. Hallucinogenic, sedative, occasionally lethal, and always dramatic. There are stories, half myth, half medical case study, of garden assistants wearing leather masks to avoid breathing the vapors. Whether that's health advice or palace cosplay is unclear. The smell here is different, earthier, somewhat musty, like dried herbs stored too long in a linen sack. You spot bundles hanging from a shaded awning, thyme, oregano, something that might be rue. Whether they were drying for medical use or ritual burning, the effect is the same. Controlled, nature, meticulously labeled, strategically deployed. A low stone bench is carved with more than just decoration. It holds rows of hollow indentations, mortar-like recesses likely used for mixing. Imagine royal doctors hunched here, grinding plant matter into pastes, sorting leaves by moon phase, arguing over which herb calms a bad omen dream and which one invites royal clarity. One scribe's version of essential oils for emotional grounding might be another's recipe for assassination. And yes, politics was always tangled in the roots. Assyrian kings were known to request soothing drafts before diplomatic meetings. Whether these were tranquilizers, stimulants, or just wine infused with something extra is anyone's guess. One tablet cheerfully notes, "The king's heart was made light before the war council." Same, honestly. But not everything here is secretive or sinister. Some of these herbs were likely used in everyday palace life, infused in oils for massages, steeped in teas for indigestion, rubbed on sandals to prevent blisters. Luxury, even in the smallest aches. You crouch near a curious plant, small fuzzy leaves, white flowers. A damaged tag reads only, "For forgetting," a sleeping aid, a memory eraser, or just the ancient world's version of chamomile. The mystery is delicious. As you rise, the breeze picks up again, ruffling the herbs, scattering their scents. It's a strange cocktail, cooling mint, bitter wormwood, something a little too sharp to be fully pleasant. The garden isn't trying to relax you now. It's testing you. And just ahead, under a vine-covered trellis, you spot a sealed jar, embedded in the ground, forgotten or intentionally left behind. Its surface is glazed, patterned faintly with images of hands holding plants. Maybe a storage jar for dried roots, or maybe a container for something more potent, remnants of a sedative or a remedy or a secret too old to name. Either way, you leave it untouched. Some plants should stay buried. You emerge from the dense herb garden into a space that feels elevated, literally. The air lifts, the breeze stretches wider, and your eyes rise with the steps of a grand, tiered structure. It's not a temple, it's not quite a ziggurat either, but it climbs like one, and it's bursting with greenery. Welcome to the tower gardens, the rooftop ecosystems, the architectural flex of vertical paradise. What you're seeing may be one of the earliest iterations of what some call hanging gardens. Though there's nothing dangling here, no ivy draping over balconies like a fantasy postcard. These gardens don't hang, they rise, step by engineered step. The Assyrians, especially during the reigns of Sargon II and Sennacherib, built sprawling palaces in cities like Dur-Sharrukin and Nineveh, with raised terraces and garden platforms. These weren't just rooftop lounges, they were monuments to divine order, high-altitude propaganda wrapped in leaves. You begin to climb. The steps are shallow but broad, designed for slow processions rather than convenience. On either side, retaining walls hold beds of earth where trees lean gently outward. Palm, acacia, citron. Their roots burrow into engineered troughs, fed by hidden channels beneath the stonework. You pause, press your hand to a wall, and feel the faintest temperature shift, evidence of water moving below. Mainstream fact: these elevated gardens used complex irrigation systems involving underground channels, ceramic pipes, and possibly even pressure-driven siphons to lift water from lower reservoirs to higher terraces. It wasn't just gardening. It was hydro-architecture with a touch of divine ambition. Historians still argue whether these terrace gardens were inspired by Babylonian prototypes or developed independently. There's even debate over whether the famed hanging gardens of Babylon actually belonged to Nineveh, not Babylon at all, a case of mistaken location with a touch of ancient propaganda. You climb further, pausing at each level. Each terrace hosts a slightly different microclimate. The lower level favors fruiting trees, figs, olives, apricots, The mid-levels are rich with aromatic shrubs and hardy evergreens. At the top, exposed to wind and sky, you find grasses, vines, and a smattering of flowering herbs, more decorative, less productive, but visually stunning. The view opens up as you reach the highest platform. From here, the entire city unfurls in dusty splendor. To the west, the Tigris glints like a sleeping snake. To the east, hills roll into haze. And here you are, standing in a garden that shouldn't exist. A skyward orchard that defies gravity, time, and logic. Quirky detail? Some terrace gardens had seating platforms on tracks, stone slabs that could be shifted manually to follow. The sun. Imagine your lounge chair repositioned by a servant every half hour so you're always in shade or light, depending on your royal mood. You walk to the edge of the upper terrace, where a parapet of carved alabaster features friezes of trees bearing impossible fruits, grapes larger than heads, pomegranates so round they look ballooned. Artistic exaggeration? Of course, but also aspiration. These gardens were less about what existed and more about what should. A fantasy of abundance made almost real. There's a wind harp nearby, its strings long broken, but the frame still hums faintly in the breeze. Another example of intentional sensory layering. You're meant to see the skyline, smell the blossoms, feel the coolness, and hear a song played by the weather itself. The king didn't just want to rule nature, he wanted to conduct it. You notice niches along the upper wall, likely for small statues or ritual offerings. Perhaps a lion figurine here, a god of rain there. The garden doubled as temple, throne, room, and telescope. A space to court both gods and guests. The highest point in the palace wasn't just for lookout, it was for looking divine. One damaged inscription lies near a basin filled with pebbles. It speaks of bringing the mountain to the city, a likely reference to the tiered structure you're standing on. The king didn't need to pilgrimage to sacred landscapes. He imported them, terraced their shapes, watered them with rivers he bent to his will. Still, the climb wasn't just metaphorical. These elevated gardens allowed for something even more important than visual dominance: climate control. Higher altitudes caught more wind, less stagnant air, better temperature distribution. Some scholars think these upper terraces served as early cooling zones, like natural air conditioning lounges for elite summer afternoons. You sit on a bench carved into the uppermost ledge. Below you, the palace murmurs with wind. The garden trails downward like a stairway of roots and petals, and for a moment the air feels ancient, not old, not musty, but wise. Like it's been here too long to be surprised by anything, and maybe that's what these tower gardens were always about. Not just control or beauty or even diplomacy, but permanence. An empire reaching upward, layering leaf upon leaf until even the gods had to stop and say, well, okay then. You lean back, feel the cool stone against your shoulders, and listen for that lost wind harp's ghost. If it ever sang, it probably sang of trees that grew in defiance, and kings who dreamed in architecture. You descend carefully from the terrace garden, your steps slow, mindful. The stone is warm from the sun, but as you re-enter the shaded walkway below, a new aroma catches your attention. Smoke. Not the acrid burn of firewood, but the sweet, savory tangle of roasting meats and simmering spices. You've arrived at the scene of one of Ashurnasirpal's more extravagant hobbies, the garden banquet. If Assyrian kings could cultivate power through greenery, they doubled down on it through feasting. And not just in any hall. These dinners, lavish, strategic, absurdly performative, took place here, in the open air, surrounded by imported citrus, trained grapevines, and irrigation-fed fountains that probably cost more than a temple roof. Ashurnasirpal. Tui was famous for his banquet. It wasn't just an event, it was a multi-day operation. Historical records describe one such party that allegedly fed over 69,000 people, diplomats, priests, nobles, soldiers, artists, even visiting dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms. You might think that's exaggerated. And yes, historians still argue whether that number included seconds. You step onto a plaza paved with decorative tiles, still chipped with age, but arranged in a radial pattern that subtly draws your eye to the center, where a long stone table once stood. Not a round table. Let's not get democratic. This was a grand U shape, perfectly angled so the king sat at the base, eyes flanked by floral arrangements, belly flanked by prestige. The food, monumental, roast game, stewed lentils, lamb glazed, with pomegranate molasses, pickled vegetables packed into clay jars, fish poached in beer, wheat cakes dusted with crushed date sugar and saffron. All prepared by palace cooks who doubled as chemists, their ingredients sometimes sourced from as far as Elam and Egypt. One quirky tablet even notes a dish described as chicken cooked in the manner of the Kassites, suggesting not just a recipe, but a diplomatic gesture. Culinary flattery, one course at a time. And then there were the drinks. Barley beer served in ceramic pitchers, sweet wines from imported grapes, and most charmingly, a spiced milk punch infused with dried herbs and honey. Some think it was a dessert, others call it a war crime. Either way, it was royal. You sit on the edge of a stone plinth, imagining the din, laughter, murmuring lyres, the gentle splash of a decorative water feature timed to match the pacing of courses. This wasn't a dinner, it was sensory theater. And the setting? Strategically botanical. Scholars have noted that certain aromatic plants were chosen specifically to enhance appetite. Mint, anise, and cinnamon were planted close to dining areas, their oils released as guests brushed past. Even the seats may have been scented, cushions stuffed with crushed lavender or bay leaf. One account suggests sandalwood smoke was funneled through hidden ducts beneath the banquet space. Subtle, luxurious, kind of ridiculous. There's a lingering debate about the role of entertainment at these events. Some argue for dancers, acrobats, musicians playing the 9-string harp. Others lean towards storytelling, royal myths, dramatized conquests, even allegorical garden tales featuring wise trees and foolish foreigners. It's possible some guests were invited to dine in silence, awed by ambiance alone, which sounds awkward unless you're allowed to mouth "wow" every few minutes. One fascinating fact: the garden itself may have been involved in the ritual. Certain flowers were scheduled to bloom around feast time. Seasonal coordination wasn't left to chance. If the king wanted lilies at dessert, someone was on bloom patrol weeks in advance. That's horticulture with a side of pressure. You imagine the king, belly full, reclining on a low couch. A servant pours water over his fingers into a painted basin. Another fans him with a palm frond dipped in rose water. He gestures toward a fig tree, telling his generals how he had it brought from a land now pacified, its fruit sweeter here than there. A metaphor, perhaps. Or maybe just dinner conversation. The guests nod, chew, sip, and pretend not to notice the strategically placed guards at the perimeter. Their spears glint in the torchlight. The air is thick with incense and diplomacy. As you wander the perimeter, you find an empty amphora, half buried in dust. The faded design features vines wrapping around a lion's paw. Wine jug? Olive oil? Maybe it held garum, a fermented fish sauce beloved by ancient palates and feared by modern noses. The label is long gone, but the memory lingers. One more lap around the garden and the party starts to fade. Not because it's over, but because time is funny like that. What once rang with instruments and chatter now hums with birdsong and breeze. The tables are gone, the benches cracked. But the layout remains, and the ghost of the meal still lingers. As you pass a half-collapsed arbor, you catch a final whiff of something. Cumin? Sumac? Hard to say. but it smells like a story that ended in laughter and oil-stained fingers. You leave behind the ghosts of feasting and follow a more winding path, narrower now, lined with low shrubs and clusters of aromatic blooms. The further you go, the more it feels like you're walking through a carefully written poem. One where every petal and puff of breeze was edited for maximum subtext. Welcome to the scented semiotics of the Assyrian garden, where everything meant something. Let's be clear. These kings didn't just plant whatever looked nice. Each tree, each flower, each stalk of spice held symbolic weight. They curated meaning like modern CEOs curate mission statements, down to the last leaf. And nowhere was this more evident than in the language of scent. Today, a spritz of perfume might be about attraction. Back then, it was ideology. You're about to smell your way through a political manifesto, and it starts with frankincense. To your right, a grove of boswellia trees, short, twisted, with bark like sun-bleached parchment. You wouldn't guess it from their humble stature, but these were sacred. Their resin, harvested in resin tears, produced the incense used in both religious ceremonies and royal audiences. The smell was sharp, slightly citrusy, with a depth that clung to your hair. It said, "Something important is happening. Mainstream historical fact: the Assyrians imported frankincense from South Arabia, modern-day Oman and Yemen, overland, via camel caravans or up the Gulf by boat. It was one of the most expensive materials they used, more precious than gold in some periods, and a regular in temple offerings, coronation rituals, and yes, garden walks designed to feel divine." 2. Your left, a line of saffron crocuses peek from the garden bed, their violet petals trembling in the breeze. Each flower yields 3 fragile red stigmas, the prized part that, when dried, becomes saffron. You lean closer and inhale. The scent is faint, slightly metallic, almost like hay, but richer. This wasn't just a culinary delicacy, it was a visual and aromatic flex. Saffron symbolized wealth, vitality, and royal exclusivity. You weren't supposed to eat it, you were supposed to be seen near it. Quirky detail: there's a record of one Assyrian noble who dyed his robes with saffron-infused cloth and was promptly accused of impersonating royalty. Turns out even your laundry could commit treason. Now imagine walking with the king through this corridor of scent. He might pause near a flowering acacia and mention how it came from a land that no longer exists. That's not idle chat. It's narrative framing. The tree isn't just fragrant. It's proof of conquest. A literal reminder that the land and its perfume now bends to him. Historians still debate whether certain scent pairings were ritualized. Some argue that specific combinations, like frankincense with rose or myrrh with date palm, were meant to invoke balance between masculine and feminine divine energies. Others think the layering was just to avoid olfactory monotony. Either way, your nose is having a meaningful day. You pass a basin where a trickle of oil-slicked water floats rose petals in lazy circles. Nearby, reeds of calamus sway, their scent medicinal, grounding. Ancient texts list calamus as both a wound healer and a mood stabilizer, though the actual effect might have been, makes you think you're calm while hallucinating bees. Your call. The real power move, though? Myrrh. Further ahead, a low, spiny shrub with peeling red bark crouches near a stone pedestal. Its resin, collected from knife wounds in the tree's trunk, was the heavy hitter of sacred scent. Thick, bittersweet, and dark when burned, myrrh was used to anoint idols, embalm royalty, and allegedly mark territories of divine favor. Burn it in your garden, and you weren't just welcoming guests, you were telling the gods to come chill. You reach a pavilion near the center of the garden. Vines climb its pillars, some still flowering. A faint groove in the floor suggests where oil burners once sat, releasing scented smoke at regular intervals. Whether the wind carried it to the palace or to the heavens is unclear, but someone, somewhere, was always meant to notice. The funny thing? These scents weren't relaxing. Not really. They were overwhelming, even theatrical. Some guests, unused to the concentration of oils, are rumored to have fainted, which, let's be honest, was probably great for the king's ego. Nothing says I'm doing well like your visitors passing out from opulence. You take a seat, on a low bench carved with floral patterns. Around you, the wind shifts again, spicy, then sweet, then something smokier. Your senses blur slightly. It's like history itself is exhaling. These weren't random smells. They were chosen, measured, performed. In a way, you're not just walking through a garden. You're reading a scroll. One line per plant. A manifesto written in wind and pollen. And the final message? Nature isn't free. It's curated, structured, staged. And when it smells this good, it's probably lying to you just a little. You turn a corner and the garden seems to stiffen. The warm, whimsical atmosphere of scented pathways and royal picnic spots gives way to something more rigid, more guarded, literally. There are guards here, or at least the memory of them. You've stepped into the portion of the palace garden that was protected not just by walls or hedges, but by men with spears. And for what? Roses? Well, sort of. In the grand scheme of the Assyrian court, even the garden needed its own security detail. Not just because it was the king's favorite thinking spot, but because it was a repository of national pride, political optics, and very valuable foreign plants that didn't take kindly to theft, clumsy ambassadors or goats. Mainstream historical. Fact, elite areas of the royal gardens, especially those close to inner sanctums or used for diplomatic events, had dedicated guards. These weren't your run-of-the-mill temple sentries. They were chosen for decorum, posture, and an uncanny ability to stand still for hours while pretending not to notice anyone. And yet, their presence tells you something fascinating. In a world where kings built temples, ziggurats, and entire cities, it was the garden, the plants, the air, the controlled beauty that warranted armed protection. That's not horticulture. That's symbolism with a sword. You stroll past what was once a patrol path. Its stones worn smooth, its corners shaded by thick canopies of tamarisk and juniper. Here, the guards would stand not just for safety, but as part of the scenery. Their armor gleaming among the leaves, their presence reminding guests that even the jasmine had rules. Quirky discovery. Some statues recovered from these garden paths are believed to be guard markers, figures in military dress, carved to mimic stationed soldiers. Decoys or divine representations? No one agrees. But they stood along the borders, flanking entry points with arms crossed and eyes forever narrowed. Assyria's version of mall security mannequins, if your mall was sacred, scented, and sponsored by conquest. Historians still argue whether these guards were meant more for ceremony or function. Were they truly protecting against threats, or simply upholding the theater of kingship? One theory suggests their primary job was to monitor behavior, ensuring no one plucked a flower, strayed off path, or got too familiar with the queen's section of the garden. Ah yes, the queen's section. Just beyond the guarded walk lies a smaller, more secluded garden, often believed to be reserved for royal women. Some texts call it the Garden of Shade and Fragrance, a poetic title that barely masks the surveillance built into its hedges. Guards didn't just keep others out. They kept certain people in. You step lightly through what remains of an archway, possibly once laced with vines, now just a curve of stone. The garden here feels softer, less formal. The trees grow in more natural clusters. Small birdhouses, now empty, cling to the branches like forgotten jewelry, but even here the presence of guards was felt. A narrow alcove, just wide enough for a man to stand silently, is tucked into the perimeter wall, peephole carved at face level. Whether it was used or merely symbolic is anyone's guess. Still, the idea that something as peaceful as a garden needed this much protection is telling. Beauty in ancient Assyria was never innocent. It was always layered with meaning, prestige, and, occasionally, paranoia. One curious note in a palace ledger refers to the incident of the broken lily. No details, no names, just a mark, a date, and a note that someone was dismissed. You wonder, was it a clumsy noble who stepped where he shouldn't? A careless servant? Or perhaps someone used a flower as a message, plucked with intent and read like a whisper? Either way, the garden had ears, and eyes, and spears. As you wander further, you reach a shaded bench carved into the wall, less throne, more lookout. From here, you can see the curve of the paths below, the way they twist elegantly but always within view. You imagine a king or commander sitting here pretending to relax, while noting who arrived late, who lingered near which tree, who looked too closely at the palace cats. Because in a place this curated, everything was performance, including vigilance. And yet, in the midst of all this guarded serenity, there's a strange peace. The guards didn't just represent fear, they also preserved stillness, enforced calm. Ensured the garden could be a place where nothing unexpected happened, where every blossom bloomed according to schedule, and no one yelled during the floral hour. You hear the wind shift, a distant echo of sandal on stone, a phantom patrol in a garden that remembers everything. You step away from the shaded alcove and follow a winding path lined with soft, flowering shrubs. The air here is quieter still, less watched, though not quite free. You're entering the space where gardens met gender, and where the lines between private power and public spectacle blurred with every blooming rose. This part of the Assyrian garden was, if records are to be believed, a place of subtle negotiation. Not diplomatic, not military, but social and domestic. A place where queens, royal consorts, priestesses, and occasionally other high-ranking women of the court could walk, observe, and maybe even influence from behind the curtain of hibiscus and fig. Now, before we go too far, let's get one thing straight. This wasn't some tranquil feminist utopia. This was still Assyria, and patriarchal norms were baked into the bricks. But the garden gave certain women a space. And that space, as always, was more complicated than it looked. Mainstream historical fact: queens like Shamaramat, possibly the inspiration for the later Semiramis legends, held immense power behind the scenes. Inscriptions mention her not only as queen, but as co-regent, priestess, and administrator. It's likely she had access to elite areas of the palace garden, not just as decoration, but as decision-maker. As you move through the corridor, you notice the design shifts again. The plants here are more decorative, more fragrant. The paths are narrower and more curved, an intentional difference from the rigid symmetry of the king's quarters. This space was meant for lingering, for strolling in slow circles, for conversation, under shade. Historians still argue whether these women's gardens were entirely separate or just portions of the larger estate. Some think they were seasonal, used during certain festivals or rituals. Others believe they were coated in plants, certain flowers and trees linked with femininity, fertility, or lunar cycles. A living calendar in blossom form. You pass a stand of myrtle bushes, their leaves glistening in the light. A symbol of love and marriage in many Near Eastern traditions. Beside them, pomegranate trees, fruits bursting with seeds, long associated with fertility, life, and regeneration. Were these placed here for their beauty, their scent, or their story? Probably all three. You pause near a low bench carved with floral motifs. The relief shows two figures, seated women, holding what appear to be branches. It's subtle, delicate, not a battlefield, not a hunt, but a moment of stillness, a portrait of women being present in a space designed for quiet influence. Quirky. Detail. One Babylonian text, later than the Assyrians but clearly influenced by them, describes a queen who trained birds in her garden to sing her name. No one's confirmed if this was practice or poetry, but the image lingers, power nestled in petals and feathers, chirping softly while decisions happened behind the trellis. And it wasn't all leisure. Some scholars believe these garden areas doubled as informal courts, places where disputes among royal women or petitions from servants were quietly heard and resolved. A bench beneath a plum tree could easily become a judgment seat. A path between iris beds might double as a corridor of secrets. You pass a water basin, shallow, still. Its surface reflects the sky, framed by reeds and lilies. It might have been a bathing pool or a wishing well, or simply a mirror for quiet contemplation. Nearby, a series of flat stones form a miniature stage. Recitations, songs, theatrical, reenactments of myths where Ishtar brings spring from the underworld. Possibly. But even here, even in this fragrant reprieve, protocol mattered. Access wasn't free. Certain areas were likely off-limits unless you held the right title, wore the correct ring, or knew which tree to stand near at the right hour. The garden offered space, but with strings. Still, you can imagine the laughter, the whispered jokes, the not-so-accidental eavesdropping through reed beds. This wasn't a quiet corner. It was a quieter voice, one that shaped narratives as gently as it trimmed hedges. You crouch near a cluster of small flowers, delicate, white, unnamed. Their scent is soft and faintly citrusy. You wonder who chose them. A queen, a priestess, a gardener with a secret, and then you hear it. The faint echo of music. A stringed instrument, maybe, a lute or lyre or something even older. It's not real, not now. But the garden holds echoes well. The stones remember rhythm. One last fact, some of the most stable. Periods in Assyrian history correspond with reigns where queen mothers were politically active. Coincidence? Probably not. And many of those women likely walked here, their sandals brushing the same gravel, their thoughts nestled between rows of flowering hyacinth and sun-warmed papyrus. You stand. Let the air pass over you again. It smells. Like jasmine, sun, and something subtler. Presence. The garden was always more than a space, it was a page, and here women wrote between the petals. The path curves again, and the light shifts with it. The sun dips lower, throwing amber light across the garden. You pass through an archway where stone lions yawn in frozen mid-roar, and suddenly, the entire space changes character. This is not the garden of the day. This is the garden of dusk, where light is soft, shadows stretch long, and reality blurs into ritual. You've entered the nighttime garden. And no, this isn't just the same garden with worse visibility. This section was built to be experienced after sunset, by torchlight, by starlight, by lamplight carried in bronze bowls by silent-footed attendants who probably took more pride in their lighting skills than most influencers do in their ring lights. The Assyrians understood that gardens behaved differently at night. The air cooled. Scents changed. Nocturnal flowers opened. Wind shifted. It was a different stage, and the actors adjusted their cues accordingly. Mainstream fact, palace complexes often held nighttime rituals, both religious and political. Offerings to Ishtar or Sin, moon-gazing ceremonies, dream interpretation vigils, even diplomatic receptions held under the cover of darkness to enhance mystery or conceal awkward tension. The garden became not just a venue, but a veil. And the lighting? Intentional. You walk beneath copper sconces shaped like palms. their torch holders designed to cast patterned shadows on the walls. Flickering light turned plain stone into dancing storyboards. One tablet even describes a procession of lions made of flame lining the path. Likely torchlight reflected against metal reliefs, but it sounds cooler without the physics. You reach a reflecting pool, wide, shallow, ringed with cut basalt tiles. The surface is dark now, catching only the shapes above. A handful of floating wicks burn in small clay dishes, bobbing gently, the flames quivering like tired eyelids. The air smells of cedar smoke and crushed lilies, a nighttime blend, heavier, then day scents, rich with lingering intentions. Historians still argue whether these nocturnal gardens were more sacred or more scandalous. Were they places for moonlit offerings and divine messages, or the empire's most discreet date spots? Probably both. Let's be honest. What better place for a secret rendezvous than a garden designed to smell seductive and hide shadows well? Quirky. Discovery. One archive tablet includes a nighttime security schedule listing nocturnal disturbances in the Myrrh Quadrant. No details, no culprits. Just one line. Your imagination can fill in the rest. Likely someone forgetting which bench belonged to which mistress, or perhaps a goat committing olfactory sabotage. You pass under another trellis, this one woven with night-blooming jasmine. The flowers are open now, their perfume intoxicating, not sweet, not floral, something more intimate. A scent that doesn't ask for attention. It takes it. Nearby, an old brazier sits cold. You run your fingers along its rim. Charred resin, bits of spice, traces of old smoke. These braziers were filled not just for warmth or light, but to release timed waves of scent into the air. Garden as sensory clock. The night garden also had a soundscape. Without the birdsong of day, wind and water took center stage. Fountains were tuned to different pitches, some to murmur, others to sing. One pathway used loose pebbles underfoot, creating soft crunches that echoed just enough to remind you. You are not alone. And the moon. Don't forget the moon. This space was built to frame it. Certain walkways align with moonrise during specific months. Water surfaces reflect its glow onto stone walls. Some think the high points of the garden were built not for defensive views, but for lunar ceremonies, sacred timing for prayers, plant harvesting, even prophecy. When the moon hit the citrus trees just right, it wasn't just pretty. It was divine punctuation. You reach a secluded corner, shaded by cypress and olive. A small stone table sits here, carved with lunar phases, perhaps once used for readings, or quiet meals, or both. The line between sacred and secular was blurrier here than the night air, and that air, it carries stories. You inhale deeply, and it's like breathing in someone else's memory. A queen brushing past with perfumed braids, a servant refilling an oil lamp with trembling hands, a priest murmuring invocations to a god who prefers silence. The breeze moves through the trees. The garden sighs. You sit finally, letting the coolness settle into your skin. The stones are warm beneath you. The leaves whisper secrets overhead. This part of the garden was made for ending, for retreat, for questions, not answers. And in the dark, everything smells closer, feels older. You lean back, look up. The stars are out now. Just a few at first, but they spread quickly, like gossip, until the whole sky blooms in quiet rebellion. And beneath it, this garden keeps breathing. As the stars begin to deepen above the night garden, you find yourself wandering toward its most whispered-about feature, the one embroidered in legend, but stubbornly elusive in fact, the hanging gardens. No, not those hanging gardens. Or maybe, yes, those, but not where most people expect. This part of the palace is ruined now, more suggestion than structure. The ground here rises in strange, stepped levels, and walls appear where they shouldn't, remnants of what once may have been an artificial mountain, carved from ambition and decorated with root systems. You're standing in the ghost of an idea, one debated across centuries. Did the Hanging Gardens of Babylon really belong to Babylon at all? Or did they bloom right here in Nineveh, built by Sennacherib, the Assyrian king with a thirst for engineering and a flair for misdirection? Mainstream historical fact. Sennacherib wrote inscriptions boasting about a wonder for all peoples, a garden irrigated by water raised by machines, possibly an early water screw system. He spoke of terraced constructions filled with imported plants elevated above the city, cooled by shade and streams. He never called it hanging, but the description is strikingly similar to what later Greek writers attributed to Babylon. Historians still argue whether the Greeks simply got the location wrong or if multiple terraced gardens existed and only one got the name. It doesn't help that ancient writers like Strabo and Philo described it centuries after the fact without footnotes. But the ruins you now walk through, they align suspiciously well with the descriptions. Multi-tiered foundations, advanced aqueduct systems, stone channels carved into sheer walls. If anything hung here, it wasn't in mid-air, it was draped. Vines, branches, moisture trickling like breath down carved masonry. You step onto a cracked platform and look up. Nothing remains of the superstructure, but if you squint, you can almost see it. Trees anchored in stone beds, their roots fed by rising waters. Balconies of green cascading down the steps like leafy curtains. A paradise built vertically, not suspended from beams, but lifted from the earth with stubborn design. Quirky detail, a later Babylonian text, describes a garden with its summit in the clouds. But Nineveh had higher elevation than Babylon. Makes you wonder, were the clouds literal? Or just another metaphor caught in a sandstorm of retellings? You walk further, tracing what may have been a staircase or a maintenance path. Servants and gardeners would have climbed this slope daily, carrying tools, soil, ceramic jugs of water, or fertilizing slurry. No fantasy here, just sweat, splinters, and careful footwork. And yet the effect, when it worked, would have been magical. An oasis rising from the city like a planted ziggurat, a green geometry against the sky, engineered to impress not just enemies or diplomats, but the gods themselves. You pause at a shallow basin, half choked with dust. Some think these served as reflection pools, carefully placed to mirror the gardens. Levels upward, an illusion of infinite growth, a mirror to heaven. Others believe they were for irrigation testing, small test beds to observe how much water a terrace needed before committing the full system. That's the joy of it all. Every stone, every wall remnant is an argument waiting to happen. Every layer hides a different theory. And here's another. Some believe the gardens were Sennacherib's way of healing homesickness. His wife, or perhaps one of his consorts, came from a mountainous region. The garden's stepped design may have mimicked the landscapes of her childhood. An act of love or control, depending on your mood. Either way, the garden became a palace myth, half fact, half fragrance. Not quite Babylon, not quite real, but very much alive in the stones and stories left behind. You pass under a broken arch where vines once curled, guided by hooks now rusted into silence. Nearby, a broken channel tilts downward into nothing. Once a stream, now a memory of water. The stars wheel overhead. You sit on the edge of a crumbling wall, the night air cooling your skin. The silence here is not empty. It's filled with possibility. This might not be the Hanging Gardens, or maybe it is. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Stranger, older, too complex to name with one city and a paragraph. What's clear is this. The kings of Assyria weren't content with monuments. They wanted myths you could walk through, stories made of bark and brick, legends that breathed and bloomed, and somewhere, beneath all the dust and broken theory, a few roots still. sleep. You make your way down from the heights of that possibly not-so-mythical structure, and as your feet find level ground again, you notice something strange. The air is different, more humid, almost as if the garden itself is sweating. The trees rustle less like leaves and more like wind stirring through carefully orchestrated breaths. You've reached the part of the garden where the Assyrians tried to do something both ambitious and wildly unhinged: control the weather. Now, of course, they didn't have satellite models or meteorological balloons, but that didn't stop kings like Sennacherib from attempting to influence their microclimate with every tool, trick, and theological whisper they had. This section is a tribute not just to nature, but to its manipulation. The first sign? The tree placements. Cypress groves here grow in unnatural clusters, clearly planted to block wind or funnel breezes along certain paths. The air hits your face, just slightly cooler than before. These weren't casual landscaping choices, they were engineered breezeways. Mainstream historical fact: Sennacherib's inscriptions boast of an irrigation system so advanced, it brought water across 50 kilometers using canals, aqueducts, and, most intriguingly, a water-raising device. Scholars suspect this could have been an early version of a screw pump or a series of bucket lifts powered by animals or water wheels. It wasn't just to water plants, it was to cool the air. Think of it as ancient air conditioning, by way of glorified farming equipment. You duck beneath a vine-covered walkway. The ceiling is open in parts, allowing filtered moonlight and breeze to create what feels like a carefully tuned atmosphere. The placement of water channels and plant types isn't just aesthetic, it's strategic. Water evaporates, air cools, and the entire temperature of this zone drops by a few degrees. It's subtle, but effective, and probably saved many a sweaty diplomat from an undignified shirt stain. Historians still argue whether these efforts actually affected temperature on a meaningful scale, or if the inscriptions just exaggerated the results. One text claims, "I summoned clouds to shade my throne," which sounds very impressive until you realize it could either mean actual cloud-baiting rituals or just a really fancy pergola. Quirky detail: some scholars believe Sennacherib employed professional weather interpreters, essentially ancient meteorologists, who advised on planting schedules, garden layouts, and when best to light incense to attract cooling winds. The line between science and superstition was, let's say, fluid. And let's not forget the wind channels. You pass a narrow corridor lined with stones that angle inward. When the breeze passes through, it whistles, not loudly, not eerily, but enough to be noticed, enough to remind you that air itself is being manipulated here. These weren't built to scare, they were built to soothe. A kind of sound therapy, tuned to the hum of breath and leaf. You pause by a sunken pool at the base of a carved rock wall. A gentle stream flows in from a channel above, spilling onto a polished surface. The resulting mist floats upward, kissing the plants and cooling the stones. It's not dramatic, but you feel it. A manufactured oasis, engineered not just to grow things, but to feel like peace. And that was the goal, wasn't it? The Assyrians weren't trying to master hurricanes. They wanted to soften a world of fire and war with spaces that smelled better, moved gentler, cooled quicker. Weather as mood, climate as courtier. You lean against a wall that might once have held hanging planters, ceramic baskets that dripped water in slow rhythms to nearby roots. A method of irrigation, yes, but also perhaps a kind of atmospheric metronome, regulating not just plants, but people. The slower the drip, the slower the heartbeat. Another inscription nearby praises the king's ability to command rain without clouds. Likely a reference to these irrigation miracles. But imagine hearing that as a visitor. You're sweating through your linen tunic, and the king appears dry, dewy, and radiant, as if heaven itself keeps him moisturized. The idea wasn't to literally change the sky. It was to make you believe that if he wanted to, he could. You find a small alcove carved with spirals, its function unclear. Some suggest it funneled airflow in specific ways. Others believe it amplified chanting. But standing there, the wind brushes past your ears in such a precise way, it almost hums. A note, a single low frequency that lingers in your chest longer than your skin. It's hard not to be impressed, and maybe a little unnerved. Because what kind of king rearranges wind? What kind of gardener builds a sky? You leave the alcove slowly, breath. Longer now, footsteps syncing with the rhythm of drip and breeze. The garden exhales again, and you follow. The wind trails behind you now, more of a hush than a howl. You re-enter a portion of the garden that feels unnervingly composed. Clean lines, square plots, no rogue branches, no wild corners. Even the gravel underfoot crunches with purposeful rhythm. This, quite clearly, is not a place for reflection or repose. It's a place for messaging. You've wandered into the most curated section of the royal gardens, the propaganda plot, if you will. Not officially labeled that, of course, but if you listen closely to the trees, they're whispering praise. Because here, everything you see was selected not to bloom, but to boast. Mainstream historical fact. Assyrian kings used their palace. Gardens as living, breathing declarations of divine right, military triumph, and global reach. These weren't just pleasure spaces. They were propaganda tools rooted in soil. Sargon II, Esarhaddon, Sennacherib, all leaned into the idea of the garden as a physical extension of royal ideology. The layout is suspiciously symmetrical, not just in the soothing, let's organize nature sense, but in a way that says, I had a scribe draw this. Trees form military rows. Flower beds form geometric mosaics, some shaped like stars, others like the winged disk of Asher. You don't plant jasmine in the shape of a god's eye for fun. Inscribed stone markers dot the edges. One proclaims, I, the king, brought this tree from a land where men speak in whistles and the moon is feared. Poetic? Probably. Accurate? Doubtful. But the point isn't proof. It's presence. This garden tells a story. And that story is, I have conquered the chaos of the world and made it bloom under my command. Quirky detail. Some of these propaganda gardens were seasonal. Planted in spring, they'd bloom just in time for diplomatic visits, then be uprooted by summer, to make space for a new message. Like ancient billboards with leaves. You stop near a raised bed of tulip-like flowers, possibly ancestors of modern irises. They're arranged in a grid so precise, you half expect a bureaucrat to leap out and fine you for stepping wrong. Behind them, a row of pines meant to symbolize stability and endurance. And at the center, a single fig tree, fabled to have been cut from the roots of an enemy king's orchard. That's right. Even the fruit here carries grudge energy. Historians still argue how much of this messaging was for outsiders and how much was internal. Were these gardens meant to awe visiting rulers or reinforce control among Assyria's own elite? Probably both. A garden like this says, look what I can make the land do. Now imagine what I can make you do. You step beneath a pergola where grapevines cling to carved wooden beams. The beams are etched, not with poetry but with kingly titles. Breaker of mountains, tamer of rivers, friend of the gods. The usual humility. The grapes? Decorative. Too sour to eat, most likely. But they look nice when they catch the sun, and that's what matters. These aren't fruits. They're proof. You pass by another water feature. This one's silent. No stream, no splash. Just a flat surface mirrored perfectly to reflect the carvings above. One scholar theorized. This was intentional. The king's name, reflected in still water, was a metaphor for eternity. Another scholar argued it was just to check your hair. Either way, the effect is eerie. You look down and see text floating over your face, backwards and bold. You keep moving. The paths widen slightly, but the message stays tight. Palm trees form a corridor leading to a stone platform, likely used for speeches or quiet observations that felt like speeches. From here, the king could look out over his garden and see more than plants. He'd see reminders of past battles, of old enemies turned into mulch, of peace, but only the kind that comes after conquest. You stand on that platform now, and the breeze lifts your hair. The sound of the garden softens, fewer birds, fewer rustles. It's as if even nature is waiting for the king to say something, but he doesn't need to. The message is already everywhere. You descend slowly, along one side, a marble bench inscribed with a myth. A god plants a tree in a desert, waters it with sweat, and watches it bloom into a throne. The moral? Kings don't just rule the land, they rewrite its DNA. You walk the last few meters through an aisle of sycamores, their leaves thick and unmoving. There's no wind here, just order. And as you step back onto the gravel, the garden seems to sigh, not in relief, but in certainty. You've just walked through a space where every flower was a footnote, every tree a treaty, every breeze a carefully worded threat. You slip out of the corridor of curated propaganda and into a quieter space. Quieter not because it's serene, but because it's been forgotten. The garden here feels tired, less maintained. The symmetry is off. The trees grow at odd angles. Some plants are clearly out of season, and others, well, they've given up altogether. This is where the garden ends, not just physically, but historically. You're walking through the twilight of a green empire, the fall of garden grandeur. It didn't happen all at once. Gardens don't crumble like palaces. They wilt. They recede. They're overgrown, repurposed, stripped for parts, or just plain ignored until even the pomegranates stop trying. Mainstream historical fact: after the death of Ashurbanipal in 627 BCE, the Assyrian Empire began to fracture. Civil wars, external enemies, and most critically, the loss of centralized power. With it, grand projects like these gardens fell out of favor. The aqueducts weren't maintained. The imported trees weren't replaced. The gardeners fled, reassigned, or simply stopped showing up. You pass a toppled pergola post, its carvings worn, its vines long gone. A single fig tree still stands, stubborn, bent like a question mark. Around it, weeds sprout between flagstones, not the poetic kind, the itchy, intrusive kind that scratch your ankles and have no use for metaphor. One surviving irrigation channel dribbles out into a cracked basin, its water thick with sediment. You crouch beside it. The stonework is still there, elaborate, overbuilt, but choked. A great design slowly strangled by neglect. Quirky detail. A Babylonian scribe who visited Nineveh years after its fall wrote, "The trees are now without names, and the flowers do not recognize the season." Poetic, yes, but also devastating. These gardens were once organized libraries of flora, each plant labeled, ranked, rotated with ceremony. Now, just wild survivors shrugging toward the sun. You walk along a path where tree roots have split the paving stones. No one's pruned them in decades. You imagine once, this route was swept twice daily by servants who sang softly as they worked. Now, silence. The birds have changed too. The trained songbirds, the copper-lunged nightingales, the mimic thrushes, fed fig and praise, are gone. What's left are crows, sharp, irreverent, excellent at surviving collapse. Historians still argue what finally did the garden in. Was it war, invading Medes and Babylonians tearing through the grounds like they were uprooting the king's memory? Or drought, climate shifts that made all the aqueducts and divine claims useless? Or maybe it was ideology, a new regime with new gods who didn't care about citrus blossoms. You find a shard of pottery near your foot, part of a basin maybe, still stained with saffron. Even in ruin, luxury lingers. There's something deeply personal about this kind of decay. A temple falls and its history. A garden falls and its grief. Because gardens aren't just structures, they're relationships. Someone had to love this space enough to weed it, to whisper to trees, to invent new devices just to keep the roses cool. And now, a jackal slinks by, too busy to care about metaphor. The wild has reclaimed what once was curated, but even here, some beauty remains. You reach a pool where water still gathers, fed by a stubborn spring. A few lotuses bloom, half-hearted, but present. A single frog watches you with the blank intensity of a creature who's witnessed too many empires fall. And you wonder, what will people think when they find your garden centuries from now? Will they ask why the wind moved that way? Why the shadows pooled just so? Will they trace your irrigation channels like they were veins in a forgotten god? Probably. One last inscription, barely legible, marks a wall near the far exit. It reads, "Let those who walk here remember I made the desert sing." But the paint has flaked. The stone is cracked. It almost reads like, "Let those who walk forget." You take a step back, and the light shifts again. The garden, though fallen, still breathes. As the dust of decline settles behind you, your path bends once more, this time toward something unexpectedly elegant. A new kind of order emerges, not Assyrian, but familiar. Familiar yet foreign. You've entered the postscript to imperial, gardening, a space not born of Assyria, but deeply indebted to it. You're standing in the echoes of paradise, the Persian adaptation. Centuries after Assyria's fall, its horticultural ideas didn't vanish. They morphed, traveled, and flourished in new soils. Most notably, in the Persian concept of paridesa, a word that literally means walled enclosure, and which gave us the modern word paradise. And yes, that concept, its roots tangle with Assyrian turf. Mainstream historical fact. The great Achaemenid kings, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, designed their royal gardens not just as leisure spaces, but as political landscapes. Geometry, symmetry, imported plants, irrigation marvels, it all echoes what the Assyrians pioneered. The Persians just took the garden gospel and added their own chapters. As you walk, the space feels cleaner, more balanced. The plants are arranged around a central water channel that divides the garden into quadrants. This four-part structure, Chahar Bagh, is a Persian invention, but likely inspired by older layouts from Nineveh and Kalhu. A river runs through it, literally. Water here doesn't trickle, it commands. The design isn't just aesthetic, it's theological. In Zoroastrian cosmology, a well-ordered garden mirrored the ideal universe, elements in harmony flowing from a divine source. You're not just walking through flora. You're in a cosmological diagram with pomegranates. Historians still argue whether Persian engineers directly inherited Assyrian irrigation techniques or independently developed similar systems. But the evidence of influence is strong. 1. Of Darius's gardens in Persepolis used an underground canal system almost identical to those found in ruined Assyrian palaces. You reach a small fountain, shallow, geometric, surrounded by aromatic herbs. The scent is sharper here. Lavender, basil, citrus. This isn't the intoxicating fog of the Assyrian gardens. This is clarity, the perfume of order, and the symmetry. Oh, the symmetry. It feels less like propaganda and more like peace. The Assyrians made gardens to impress. The Persians made them to invite quirky detail. Some Persian gardens included conversation corners, little niches with benches facing one another across a reflecting pool, a design that suggested, politely, that dialogue was divine. Think therapy gazebo meets imperial Zen den. You sit at one of these corners, and you wonder, did the old Assyrian kings ever sit and talk in their gardens? Or did they simply declare? Maybe paradise for the Persians was found not in dominance over nature, but in harmony with it. And yet, harmony has its own kind of power. A garden this balanced makes war feel vulgar. That's influence. That's strategy. You rise again and pass under a trellis of grapevines arranged in perfect lines. Above you, a quote from a Persian inscription. I planted these in memory of my father's victories, but I walk here for silence. It's a shift. The garden, once a brag, becomes a whisper. But the Assyrian fingerprints remain. In every artificial hill, every rerouted spring, every plant pulled from one climate and made to thrive in another, you see echoes of that earlier obsession, to bend nature, not break it. The Persians didn't erase the Assyrian garden. They translated. It smoothed its edges, swapped thunder for balance, and in doing so, they created something that would last far longer. Persian gardens would inspire Roman villas, Islamic riads, Mughal palaces, Spanish courtyards. Even the idea of the English garden owes a nod indirectly to a king who once bragged he could make a desert sing. You reach the end of the quadrant. The water flows quietly now. The air is lighter. You feel not impressed, but calmed. And that may be the most powerful legacy of all. You leave the tidy quadrants of Persian tranquility behind and drift into a much messier landscape, not in design but in legacy. Here the garden doesn't bloom. It's being dug up, dusted off, misnamed, misfiled, misremembered. You've entered the age of rediscovery, or rather, misdiscovery. The colonial chapter. This is the 19th century. The British and French are poking around Mesopotamia with spades in one hand and sketchbooks in the other. They're convinced they've found the cradle of civilization, and they're here to cradle it awkwardly, like someone holding a very old, very fragile vase upside down. Mainstream historical fact. Early archaeologists like Austin Henry Layard uncovered the ruins of places like Nineveh and Nimrud. Those same palaces, those same gardens, but didn't always know what they were looking at. Decorative paving stones were mistaken for temple floors. Irrigation channels were declared sewer systems. And garden remnants, often overlooked entirely. You walk along what's left of a half-dug trench, once a garden path, now a scar on the earth where layers of history were peeled back with pickaxes and imperial excitement. In some cases, perfectly preserved stone. Basins were removed, packed into crates, and sent to the British Museum, labeled vaguely as domestic plumbing. And the gardens? They weren't sexy enough. Quirky detail. One early excavation team described a beautifully tiled garden courtyard as probably a servant's latrine, based solely on the fact that it had water features and a drain. A few decades later, it was reclassified as ritual bathing area, then again as decorative promenade. The truth? Likely a garden for the royal consort. The mislabeling? Peak academic mood swings. Historians still argue whether the bias was intentional or just a product of 19th century tunnel vision. Back then, war, conquest, and phallic statues got more attention than subtle canal work and flowering symbolism. The idea that a king might flex his power by arranging sycamores didn't fit the imperial narrative. You pass a display board, modern now, installed by a more recent excavation team. It shows illustrations of how the gardens might have looked. Digital reconstructions, virtual plants, perfect weather. Not a weed in sight, not a beetle, not a bit of bird droppings on the basalt. It's beautiful, yes, but suspiciously sterile. One line reads, Assyrian gardens were decorative. You sigh. That word again, decorative, as if the trees planted to honor conquered gods, the canals engineered to drag rivers uphill, the scent trails mapped like symphonies, were just nice little extras. Background material, gilding on the war machine. But slowly the scholarship started to shift. Archaeobotanists began analyzing soil samples, discovering pollen traces from non-native species. Cuneiform tablets referencing trees of distant mountains were cross-checked with elevation charts. Suddenly, those overlooked spaces between buildings weren't empty. They were engineered Edenic statements. Still, even today, Assyrian gardens get less press than the Hanging Gardens. Despite mounting evidence, they may have been the Hanging Gardens, or at least their seed. You walk past a collection of discarded tools, spades, brushes, measuring sticks, all left by a dig site recently closed for the season. The trench they framed shows a pattern of brickwork shaped like a branching root system, likely a tree bed, likely a royal one. And yet the placard nearby reads, "Function uncertain." It's humbling, this part of the journey, to see how even a garden designed to immortalize a king can be forgotten, misread, mislabeled. To know that for every stone they dug up, a dozen meanings slipped through their fingers. You pause near a stack of half-buried clay shards. One still has a cuneiform mark etched along its edge. Maybe it once held saffron, or lily bulbs, or just oil for the evening lamps. You brush some dust away. The script is faint, but still there. A voice, fragile, almost, but not quite, heard. You step back and look at the excavation pit. It's deep, silent, patient, and in that silence the garden waits. Not for glory, not for replanting, but for understanding. One day maybe someone will read it properly. Until then, it breathes beneath the dust. You walk now not through a garden, but through its memory. The present wraps gently around the past as you step across a path leading toward modern-day Nimrud. What was once Kalhu, once the emerald heart of Ashur-Nasirpal's dominion, is now a landscape of ruins, gravel, and sky. But even here, especially here, the garden lingers. There are no standing trees, no perfumed breezes, just foundations, low walls, bits of broken pottery half buried in dust, and the faint ghost of an aqueduct, line etched across the horizon. Yet something pulls at you, a shape, a rhythm, the faint sense that if you squint and stand just right, the beds and basins begin to reassemble in your mind. Mainstream historical fact. Nimrud was devastated by conflict in the 21st century, with ISIS militants destroying large sections of the site. In response, archaeologists, historians, and local preservationists began working not just to preserve what was left, but to remember what had been, including the gardens. You walk past a reconstructed column base, its stone newly reinforced but still bearing scars. The inscriptions that once praised cedar groves and vineyards are chipped, but some lines survive. "I planted," it reads. "I gathered. I gave shade to the throne." A boast, yes, but also a poem. Nearby, a rusted irrigation pipe, modern, runs, parallel to where the ancient canals once fed the palace trees. Not for olive groves this time, but for the preservation of ruins. Water still flows here. It just serves a different kind of route. You sit on a low stone, your back to a wall that once bordered the perfumed walkways. There's a plastic tarp. In the distance, flapping lightly in the wind. The sun hangs low. The birds are untrained. No one here is singing in cuneiform. And yet, you can almost hear it. The hush of vines brushing walls, the whisper of sandals on gravel, the measured voices of gardeners discussing what to prune, what to preserve, and what the gods might think of those yellowing lilies. Quirky detail? Local. Guides sometimes say the air still smells sweet at dusk, even when nothing grows nearby. Just a hint of myrtle, jasmine, or wet earth. Placebo? Maybe. Or maybe it's memory, lingering in the soil. You walk one last stretch of path, stone broken by weeds, weeds bent by wind. The way the light falls here, it flattens the centuries. The shadows of the old trees line up with the depressions in the earth. And for a moment you're walking not through a ruin, but a resurrection. Because even when the walls are gone, even when the canals have run dry, a garden built with such obsessive care, such deliberate symbolism, doesn't truly vanish. It waits in stories, in pollen trapped in the subsoil, in dreams and documentaries and gentle midnight strolls like this one. You sit again, let your eyes close. No guards, no scribes, just you, the wind, and the impression of a tree that once shaded a throne. The garden was never just about plants. It was about presence, and you are here. Now the gravel quiets beneath your feet, and the air grows softer with the night. The sounds fade, stone giving way to shadow, wind tapering into stillness. Even the memory of water hushes, evaporating slowly into the dusk. You settle once more beneath the invisible canopy, the shape of a tree long gone, but somehow still, offering shade. The scent of old fig, of rosemary once crushed by sandals, of long-cooled incense clings faintly to the edges of thought. These are not smells you know, not really, but you feel them. In the quiet part of your chest where ancient things go to wait. The stars above Nimrud are steady now. They don't shimmer for attention or pulse like messages. They simply are, like the ruins, like the soil, like the stubborn outlines of a garden drawn over and over again in dust. Breathe deeply now. You've walked through centuries, watched kings bloom and wither, seen propaganda written in petals, and power held together with pressed mint leaves. You've touched the edge of something extravagant, yes, but also deeply human, a longing to shape beauty, to bend chaos into calm, to sit among vines and know you built something that whispers after you're gone. Let your limbs loosen. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the wind that curls through the quiet ruins. Let the garden close its gates softly behind you, and let sleep finally grow. End of script. Sweet dreams.